Yeah, I'll record on my end here too. I just clicked it on, and if it's good, we'll save it, and if it's bad, we'll just pretend the whole thing never happened and forget it was ever a thing. Let me see here. Yeah, yeah, exactly. If it works, we brag about it till the end of time, and if it doesn't work, we quickly put it out of our heads and act like it wasn't a thing. Let me screen. Am I up? Can you see me? Okay. Yeah. I think the best place to start with your question about, we use a standard down bet the flop, over bet the turn, do we barrel off the river type strategy would be, let me look at this. This is a report built off of my database. This is for what the player pool does when it's a single race pot. They're the out of position player is the pre-flop caller. This is for check folding the river. The data up here at the top, this is just regardless of how you got to the river, any check fold in that formation. Just to give you a breakdown on what you're looking at, this makes a lot of sense once you're familiar with the format, but probably makes no sense the first time you're taking a look. The left column is just the size. It's a sizing band centered around 0.3, 0.5, 0.7, etc. So the 0.3 band is bets that are 0.2 to 0.4 percentage of pot. The 0.5 is 0.4 to 0.6, 0.6 to 0.8, 0.8 to 1. The overbet bands start to get a bit larger. This one is a small overbet, 1 to 1.25. The 1.5 band is 1.25 to 1.75. 1.75 to 2.25. And I think the 4x is even larger. If I remember correctly, that goes to like 3.25 to almost 5x to 4.75. But it's a band there centered around that size. What we have over here in the middle, the sample size for my database, how many times this event popped up. The database itself has about 93, 94 million hands from 2019 and 2020, various sites, 200 no limit and above. The pool stat is the frequency at which they fold to a riverbed of that size in that particular formation. The one minus A, that's a 1 minus alpha calculation for how often they need to be folding for a bluff to be break even. The showdown bias there, that's estimates from other work I've seen other people do based on the fact that databases don't always have exposed hole cards, so there's some showdown bias, and that when you're betting with value hands, you block their calls and don't block their folds, and vice versa. So there is some extent of showdown bias in the data if you don't have clairvoyant hand histories where you can see everyone's hole cards. The other numbers here, the EV of pot, that's just a mathematical calculation. If they're folding 53% of the time against a small bet, that means you're capturing 38% of the pot by making that bluff. The margin of error is a binary variance calculation based on the sample size to estimate how much noise is in these stats based on the sample size. Because I can look at these numbers and know that 33,000 is a pretty large sample, but I don't have context for, well, how much swing does that make in the percentage of the folds kind of thing. So the margin of error is something to help me estimate that. And then the confidence interval takes those margin of errors into account to say, for the half pot bet, betting half pot bet on average captures 37% of the pot based on how much they overfold. And then the confidence interval, because there's so many samples for that, and this is such a large sample, it's the most common formation, that confidence interval is very tight, 0.37 to 0.37. I've also got some other data here. For this particular line, a lot of this data is not very interesting. This is texture type stuff. This is compared to just all across all textures, how often do these certain texture patterns see a deviation where they fold more or fold less? And for this particular spot in the game tree, regs check folding the river in a single race pot when they're out of position. The texture is not making a very big difference. I haven't found very much nuance in that particular formation against that player type at all. Similar idea here for formations, when you're in the big blind versus the button as opposed to big blind versus under the gun, how often they over or under fold. So they're actually over folding in my giant database a bit more when you're under the gun than as if you're the button, which I guess that makes sense because if you're in late position, players are going to go ahead and speculate that you have more bluffs, will be bluffing more often, and will probably look you up slightly more often. Same thing here with the small blind. The real point of interest is that the small blind is not overfolding quite as much as the big blind is. However, these are all minor rounding errors around the edges. If you look up top here, in general, these river bets are massively overfolded, 25%, 20%. They're just missing the calling frequency by so much. We also have some line modifications here, so take a look at how these different lines mean they're overfolding or underfolding compared to average. I use this type of approach for bluff catching and bluff raising rivers as well. It's not as interesting for bluffing them off rivers because the end result is they fold so goddamn much on the river it doesn't really matter what the texture is or what the line is. In most cases, you can pretty much keep bluffing in this spot. Now that said, there is some nuance to barreling the river based on how you got there that some of these lines don't capture quite as well. So what else I've taken the liberty of pulling out of this database is taking a look at how, in more specific lines, how often they're folding against various river bet sizes in the check call, check fold line, and then even furthermore with some of the sizing broken down. So in general, they're folding, overfolding by something like 20% on average, depends on the sizing band, but against a half pot band, they're overfolding by something like 25% or maybe 20% against a 70% bet on the river. In that check call, check fold line, we're still seeing overfolds, but not as dramatic, which is to be expected. They're going to be stronger if they've called your bet twice and to call you down that third time. But we are still seeing overfolds, so the triple barrel in a vacuum is still pretty good. But we can get even more specific and more granular with the data here, and we can take a look at the check call, check fold, or check fold line based on what sizings were used earlier. This next report that I'm hovering my mouse around right now, this is that line you were talking about earlier, Money, where you used a small bet on the flop and then overbet the turn. So this is check call, check fold, a roughly 30% flop bet. In this database, the way that's set up is anywhere from 20 to 40% of pot. And then followed up by an overbet on the turn, 150% overbet. So anywhere from 1 1/4 to 1 3/4 is going to be caught up in this filter. And what we're showing, to go back to that question you originally asked a few minutes ago, is are they really still folding on the river after you bet the flop small and then overbet the turn? And I say the data tells us the answer is a resounding yes. That half pot bet's getting overfolded still by something like 19%. It's capturing something like 28% of the value of the pot on average, and even the larger bets tend to work as well. That 70% bet seems to capture about 15%. So if you're asking me, it's a real simple question. After you bet the flop small and overbet the turn, do you want to continue barreling the river? I say the answer is pretty much always going to be yes. Is the data showing us here that they're overfolding for pretty much every size? Some sizes more than others, some sizes capture a larger share of the pot than others, but I think the answer to your question right off the bat is yeah, you do want to continue following through on the river. Does that all make sense? Anything I've said need to be repeated or clarified further? Yeah, I would say to some extent that's true. I think that's even more true with fish than with regs. This is the reg database, not the fish, but I've got this same report for fish as well. We can pull that up if you want to see it. The other thing I would say to keep in mind is that the overfolds for the larger bet sizes, the swings are more dramatic there. You know, I mean, like here, even though the sample's not all that large, you know, the 2.5x captures something like 22% of pot. That's a 6% overfold. But if you start swinging a couple percent off that one direction or the other, that can swing pretty wildly. The other thing to keep in mind is that blockers do have some value to this. You know, the blockers are typically worth somewhere in the range of 2 to 3%, depending on exactly how good the blocker is and what kind of texture you're talking about. So the way I tend to do this in practice is that I may not have multiple bet sizes pre-flop, flop, or turn. I may just, you know, keep it nice and simple, stupid. I may use my standard 2.5x pre-flop raise. I may use that 30% bet on the flop, and then, you know, if it's the kind of texture where I want to be overbetting, I'll just either overbet 150% or check. You know, and that's not that hard a strategy to implement once you know what you're doing and how you want to do it. That's not terribly complicated. The river, I might start using multiple bet sizes, even though it's probably not as necessary. But what I'll generally do on the river is my value hands, like my real big lock hands, like my set type hands that don't block the best call downs, I'll put those in the overbet for value line. My more marginal value hands or my real strong value hands that do have the board locked down, the hand like top set, I may put that in the smaller size. And then what I will do is I'll usually give up with virtually none of my bluffs. I'm really only checking back stuff that I think is going to have some degree of showdown value. I'm not gonna check back a busted draw that's 10 high. I'm gonna bluff that. What I'll usually do is, as a default, I'll put the bluffs into the smaller size, usually around the 70% sizing. But what I will do so I still have a few bluffs in the larger sizes, I will pick the couple of combos that have the absolute best removal or blocker properties and use those in the overbets. So I may be blasting off on the river with my second, third, and fourth set type hands, and then I may have some kind of straight draw. Like I may have a gut shot that doesn't block his straight draws that might have called a couple of barrels as heavily and also blocks his best top pair type hands to calm me down, or whatever the best blockers might be. Whatever the best blockers are to the best called on hands on the river, I might put those in the overbet line because you squeeze out a little bit more value by putting the best blockers in the overbet line where the blockers are more valuable if you do want to split the sizes at all. If even that's getting to be a bit too complicated, too much going on for you, when you decide I just want to keep it simple, you could throw pretty much everything in just that smaller, more standard 2/3 type size and get away with it just fine. But the bottom line here is, to your original question is, after you down bet the flop and over bet the turn, should you be surrendering the river with your bluffs because they're just going to be too sticky after calling the big over bet in the turn? I think the answer is a resounding no, based on the data I'm looking at and based on my own experience from playing the game playing that way. Does that all make sense? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, going back up just in a vacuum, regardless of what kind of line and earlier bet sizing, conventions used to get there. Yeah, I mean the overfold percent can be slightly misleading because the really most important thing is, in a vacuum, which bet size for a bluff is going to capture the largest percentage of the pot. And seeing here, even though the 30% bet is overfolded by something like 5% more than the half pot bet, the value of the pot, the share of the pot they capture, is both virtually the same. So, but either way, the bottom line is that these small bets are in fact gathering a very large share of the pot. In a vacuum for all check folds in this formation, the smallest bet's getting 38%, half pot 37%, the 2/3 pot's about 33%, close to pot's about 31%. Then the overbets seem to gather anywhere from 30 to upper 20% as well, for the most part. But yeah, I would agree, and a lot. Yeah, and yeah, and yeah, and yeah, and and keep in mind this is for every time in that particular formation, another reg is check folding in the river. So that's where the pot checks all the way through the river with no bets, and a line like that's going to be folded heavy just because they're going to be so gutted they haven't put a single penny in the pot, even after it was, if checked twice and they're still not stabbing, they're probably pretty weak at that point, and the data tends to back that up. Mhm. Yeah, we can. Yeah, I mean, from what I've been finding is that the flop defense has actually gradually gotten pretty good. I mean, this the small bet stuff at one point in time it was novel and people didn't know how to defend it and got a lot of overfolds. But the database I'm working off of now, and this has a massive sample size. I mean, what I'm showing here is that the PIO frequency for the solves I ran, these PIO frequencies here were derived by me through running multi-flop aggregation reports off a subset of sims with multiple sizes in all sorts of spots. Um, and that was for button versus big blind for sort of standard, solver approved button raise first in and big blind call type ranges. What I found right there is that PIO says that the reg should be or not the reg, anybody should be check folding versus that 30% bet about 36% of the time. And in this particular database I'm working off of, which has 205 million data points. It's got 90 some million hands in the database, and for the flop check fold in that very specific formation, we have 1.4 million data points. So I mean, it's not a small sample by any stretch of the imagination. They're check folding 36.1%. So on average, the pool is actually getting pretty close to that optimal frequency, and then the PIO approved check raise frequency against that size is about 16%, and the pool's hitting 14.4. So they're missing a little bit, but they're not missing too much. Yeah, yeah. This is hands. I believe I don't have anything older than 2019 in this database at this point, and it's 200 no limit plus, and it's filtered for regs. I've got a separate filter for fish, and the distinction I draw between them is that the filter I have is that a reg is someone who has shown virtually no limps. I think the maximum amount of limps is 2% to allow for a little bit of limping behind or limping the small blind or some of that kind of nonsense. And it's also filtered for the VPIP preflop razor gap. It's something like 12 or 13%. I forget exactly where I arbitrarily set that line, but something like that. And I've got fish or people that don't fall into the category of regs, whether they're limping too much or their preflop raise VPIP preflop raise gap is too wide. So it is filtered in both the regs and fish. It's 200 no limit above and only. So it's no micro stakes or any of that kind of stuff going on here either. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So would they check raise and you raise back over the top? Uh huh. No, we well well no we do have some data on that, but to answer Money's question, I guess we don't know for a complete certainty, but we can get a pretty good idea by running by running detailed, complicated sims in PioSolver and then running subsets of them, then running the multi-flop aggregation reports to see what the average frequency is, weighted by how often those flops are out there. That's how all these Pio-derived frequencies are that I've got. So that's where 36% came from. That's where 16% came from, and I do have the answer to Slorgo's question as well about, well, what about a 3-bet on the flop here? That's the check raise fold column over here on the flop after check fold and check raise. So the Pio derived frequency that I found for that was 47%, and what I've got to show the pool doing is just shy of 43, 42.9% over 12,000 plus samples. Now, the Pio frequencies are going to be pretty heavily influenced by the bet sizes that you chose. I tried to choose pretty reasonable and average sizes for the pool, but the correct check raising frequency, if you're using a 60% of pot check raise, is going to be different than if you're using a full pot check raise. I mean, of course, I'm sure you guys all understand that. That's not too complicated. And if the average pool check raise is not matching the data I used in Pio, that's going to be somewhat misleading. But I do believe the sizes I used are all pretty reasonable for that and do pretty closely match to what the pool is doing. I think. No. Now they're underfolding against the 3-bet money because the Pio says they should be check raising then folding 47%, and the pool's only doing it 43%. So I don't think there's a ton of merit in piling a ton of bluffs into that line. Personally, because the way I try to approach this stuff is I try to play sort of like a very simplified, edges rounded off, dumbed down version of what GTO would look like. Like keep my frequencies mostly pretty similar, or use like range betting where the frequencies won't match, but the EV loss is negligible. And I like to keep my range from getting split off and having the game tree, multiply and magnify itself to be so massively large too early on. So a lot of times I won't even have a flop three betting range in that spot, just because they're not punishing me with check raises all that much, where the counter strategy is to 3-bet them back. And my range gets a lot easier if guys want to start check raising my range bet, where I'm just going to continue my entire continue range with the call. And that way they don't know if I'm floating with a backdoor flush draw and 2 overcards, or I've got the stone cold nuts and I'm just waiting for them to pile more money in on later streets. And I feel like I'm starting to gather more and more information about what their range looks like, and all they know is that I haven't folded. I still have all my continue range. Like I'm not caught in the part of the game tree where I'm gutted because all my sets are going to funnel the money back in on you early on, and I've just got some marginal 1 pairs and some shitty draws kind of thing. So the way I try to approach this stuff is, take a simplified, dumbed down, mimic simplified version of GTO and get yourself to the river where you can't make too many mistakes on the river. And then based on the reads you have from what you can tell by the way they're playing their hand, just through your own poker theory and skill and knowledge, and your pool data for where the pool is making massive mistakes, that's where you really drop the hammer. And that's where the solver likes to do the real hard exploits for the most part anyway. If you node lock a solver to the player overfolding by, something trivial, 1 or 2% on the river, something minor, solver's going to start bluffing everything. Solver's going to surrender nothing. So that's why I'm saying don't give up your bluffs, because they're overfolding. You don't care how much they're overfolding, you just know that they are. Same thing with bluff catching. If they're bluffing too much by 1 too many combo, just fuck this guy. I'm calling everything now. I'm calling all my bluff catchers because you're over bluffing by 1 combo. And if you're out of whack by that much on the river, or you're that little on the river rather, the exploit is just to drop the hammer so hard. So I think that the philosophical approach is keep yourself as simplified, balanced as possible on the earlier streets, and get to the river where you can figure out where they're at in their range better than they can figure out about you, and then that's where you really punish them. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Uh, yeah. Let's see here. Um, okay, so against the small C bet on that board, the average fold is 36.1%, and then some deviation. Yeah, 30, yeah, 36 is what the pool is doing, and 36.1 is what the pool is doing, and 36 is what Pio tells us is the correct frequency. Now taking a look, and it looks like the ace high flops, they're folding slightly more. They're going 38.4 as opposed to 36.1. A single Broadway flop slightly less. Uh, here's a dramatic deviation. The low 10 to 2 high flop, they're only check folding 28.5%. Now keep in mind that what Pio tells us 36% is the correct check fold frequency. It doesn't mean you check fold 36% blindly regardless of the texture. Pio will also deviate based on the texture. So I don't want to jump to a conclusion and say that they're check folding here too little on the 10 high flop. That doesn't mean that you can bet them small. They're supposed to be folding less on that low board. You're supposed to be floating all kinds of overcards, backdoor flush draw type stuff on that spot. So keep that in mind as well. This doesn't tell us they're making a mistake because the amounts are deviating. It just tells us that they are deviating. They may be doing that correctly. But let's see here. Like monotone flop, they're folding a few more percent, 39 as opposed to 36. Paired flop, no, no, no. Mhm, 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 mhm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. 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 Let's take a look. Uh. Oh, thank you. Check raises. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, this I put together, I mean, I had dabbled in some mass database analysis over the past, I don't know, probably about 2 years, but during Corona, I really buckled down and built this massive monster of a machine. And then there was a few things I didn't like. There was a few bugs, a few spots that weren't quite set up the way I wanted them to, and there's a few levels of detail I didn't have the way I wanted. So I'm actually in the process of rolling out the 2.0 version, and what you're looking at is the proof of concept of the most common line for the 2.0 version, where you're getting some of these extra texture patterns and that sort of stuff. But let's see here, 14.4%. That's the standard check raise percentage against the small flop C bet. Now, ace high, okay, we're seeing some more deviation here, like that low 10 high board against that small C bet. They're ramping their check raise up to almost 21%. Now, once again, you're probably supposed to do that, but the pool is in fact doing so. So that's information we wouldn't otherwise have. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. 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 Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Uh. No. No, I don't have king high flops. No. Interesting. Maybe I'll throw that filter in next time too. Shouldn't be too hard to add. Yeah, in fact, okay. Yeah, I mean that's it would take me virtually no effort to build another filter and throw it in there. I have to rebuild the reports once it's done, and that takes time. But that's just clicking a button and waiting. So I'll probably add king high flops next time I'm upgrading the database, just because why not? Yeah. Um. Okay. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Agree entirely. Oh yeah, no, it's like no, no, no. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's real bad. Uh-huh. Yeah. I have a custom stat I built in my poker tracker. I've called it river bluff efficiency. It's meant to somewhat mimic that river call efficiency stat, where it's a measure of how many dollars you return to you when you call a river bet. And it doesn't differentiate if your hand's a bluff or a value bet. And what it is just a measure of every time you bet the river, how much money is returned to you from your own bet or on called pots. When your bet is called, it's considered you lose that money, and when your bet gets through, you keep that money plus pick up the pot right there. And the way it's calibrated is that 1.0 is just like 1.0 for river call efficiency, that your river calls are breaking even, or your river bets are breaking even as far as picking up the pot without showdown. And I really don't give up rivers very much, and my river bluff efficiency stat is still positive. It's still something like 1.2, 1.25. So I mean, if I just blindly don't check down and surrender rivers, I'm more profitable than if I just, decide to start turning some hands into surrenders and surrendering the pot. Even picking up 10 or 15% of the pot's much better than picking up 0% of the pot. Make sense? Let's see here. Yeah, it's still not too bad here, actually, believe it or not, over this entire database. Like the small bet, which part of it is probably you really shouldn't be using it. It's not used all that much. They are overfolding against the small bet. 30% in the pool versus 24% from the PIO frequencies. But the half pot bet Pools folding 39.3, Pio says 36. So that's a slight overfold, but not enough where you're going, okay, this is a hot spot. I can just start shoveling money in on these guys. Uh, same thing with 70%. That's 45.5 versus a 44% Pio recommended frequency. I think I've probably talked about this in the chat at some point somewhere. I'm sure very informally, but from what I've seen looking at solves, like if you run a solve where you give it all sorts of options on the turn just to see which sizes it picks on certain textures, in most spots where it's going to pick 50 and 70% a decent amount of the time, it seems to kind of mix between the two, and there isn't any obvious rhyme or reason that one is clearly better or clearly better for certain hand types. It just seems like both options are pretty similar, so it mixes some hands back and forth into both. So I'm not gonna play a strategy where I have a 50% or 70% bet on the turn. I'm gonna pick one or the other, and because they seem to overfold a bit more against that 50% turn bet than the 70%, I tend to use the half pot bet on the turn if I'm going to not use the overbet. It's a way you can subtly exploit the pool while still keeping an overall gameplay that's approximating GTO. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, and then the overbet they also fold slightly too much, 64 versus 62%. But keep in mind that 2% there against the overbet is going to be more valuable than 2% against a half pot or two-thirds bet, and here's why. These reports are almost displaying the inverse or backwards from what really matters. Think about it like this. If you're supposed to fold 62% of the time against the overbet, that means you're supposed to continue 38% of the time. So if you overfold by 2 or 3% out of 38%, that's a much larger portion of your correct continue range than against that small bet where, Pio says you can fold 24%, you're supposed to continue 76. If you miss 2% out of 76% of your range, that's probably not that big a mistake. But missing 2% out of 38%, that's much bigger. So these 2%, these larger bets, these couple of percent here and there, they mean more on the overbet size just because the continue range is already supposed to be so shallow. Does that make sense as well? Yeah, yeah, that's a very nice way to say it. Yes, exactly. Hmm. 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 Uh-huh. Yeah. 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 Mostly the flush closing turns, and yeah, yeah. Hmm. 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 Okay. Hmm. Yeah, you got to be careful with it. Doesn't seem like they call enough. Like I think like going back to some of these old school thoughts where you should just overfold the rivers because they never bluff the river. Well, it seems like they never bluff the river because when you bluff catch, you're supposed to lose most of the time. If you bluff catch a half pot bet, you only have to be good 25% of the time. So if they show up with value 2/3 of the time, you're going, man, screw this. I'm not paying this guy off again. They've always got it. Well, they have it most of the time, but they don't have it often enough. Similar thing with the turnover bet. It seems like they always fold, but they're supposed to be folding a ton because you're betting so damn much. So you got to be careful with what it seems like they're doing. That's I used to fall into some of that, and that's why I'm like, well, let me look at the data. Who cares what I think is going on? Let's see what the stats tell me. Yeah. Hmm. Mhm. Yeah, and well, the other thing is that you set yourself up to win the big pots, you know. And it's like, okay, I can, you know, I could bet smaller to get them to call me, but if you, even though they won't do it as much because they're folding more because they're supposed to fold more, if you overbet the turn and you've still got a real nice hand, you've set yourself up to win a massive pot or stack the guy because you've got that pot so bloated. So there's, you know, these things all chain together in some ways that are hard to understand. Yeah, I mean, I don't really split ranges on the turn too often where I'm using multiple sizes. I more or less take a look at the board texture, you know, and the line that we're in, and decide what bet size I want to use on that, and just simplify to one. Usually the overbet in this barreling line in position, but specifically flush closing turns is the most common one, you know, and that's probably just about the only one in my mind. You know, those will be the smaller bet, the half pot or the 2/3 or whatever you'll have, you know, and I'll bet all the hands I'm betting for that size. I won't overbet at all if I'm using the half pot bet. If you're splitting, it gets more complicated, and it's hard for me to keep all this stuff straight. You know, if I start, even though it's still a fairly simplified strategy to have, you know, one size pre-flop and then just range betting one size on the flop. If I start splitting my hands, value bets and bluffs into two different sizes, then I get to the river where that tree is already branching out, where it's like, okay, I put almost all my sets in that overbet size, so now I don't really have strong hands in this smaller size that I used on the turn, and you know, how do I construct my range and what sizes do I pick? And to me that gets more complicated than it's worth. I'm sure it's more theoretically correct to do it the way you describe, but I mean, I'm a big fan of cutting corners and standing on the shoulder of giants to get where I'm trying to go. So I'll simplify and make things easier, even if it's not theoretically correct. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, yeah, and another real nice implication of using that particular strategy is that if you're using overbet sizes on the turn, you're supposed to be particularly polarized, which means a lot of your marginal, you know, your second pair, your third pair type hands, your weaker top pair, a ton of stuff is checking back, which means you have a ton of hands that function really well as bluff catchers in your check back line, and that dovetails really nicely with other stuff the pool does wrong in that when they check call the flop and then the turn checks through, that's a line where you can pick off a lot of bluffs where they lead the river on you. So you, by doing that, you set them up to play into additional mistakes they make. And you know, when you start looking at some of these spots where the pool makes mistakes and start building strategies around them, you can really start funneling guys in ways that are subtle but repeatable into lines where they make mistakes, and just keep, you know, you're intentionally creating profitable situations for yourself by doing that. So the overbet turn strategy works really well with that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but just the way the pool has been playing over the past couple of years, it fits together nicely. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well, you know, the thing is, you'll look like a clown every once in a while, but you know, we're not doing this stuff to not look like a clown every time. I'll gladly look like a clown every once in a while if I'm still winning the war. You know, I'll surrender a battle here or there. You know, and it's also not like I'm completely out of whack or completely out of balance. My overbets are going to have some bluffs, you know, some draws that brick out that I follow through with on the river, you know, or maybe they decide to look me up. Oh, and this time I got the set, you know, and now you're looking like a clown for heroing down with third pair on a massive pot, and just, oh, he had middle set the entire time. Of course he did. Why else would he be overbetting and blasting away like that? So it goes both ways, you know. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Oh yeah. 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 Why so much? I'm out, you know. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, this database is not based off of live hands, you know. It's not based off of Zoom hands either for that matter. It's based off of regular. I don't think I have any Zoom hands in here. I think I intentionally excluded them. So because it's possible the Zoom pools play differently, and I try to avoid Zoom, so I didn't even give myself any way to start jumping in that shithole. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Absolutely. And I chuckle whenever, I overbet the turn with, I've got 10-9 for an open-ended straight draw, and I brick out, and I, throw in a two-thirds bet on the river, and they tank for a while and fold. And they're thinking that exact same thing. I've got a decent top pair, but he's, he already blasted me on the turn. If he's bluffing, he would bet bigger. I mean, these guys start getting the level in wars. If he's really trying to make me fold a hand like this, he wouldn't bet small. He's betting small so I can call. I'm not going to pay him off, and mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. You're not bluffing the river to make him fold those monsters. You're bluffing the river to make him fold a significant enough percentage of his range that he got there with that your bet becomes profitable. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. That's how I took it. Yeah. 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 In the yeah. Yeah. This yeah. Well, this database is not also just U.S. hands. I've also got a significant number of PokerStars hands in here as well. I mean, to get up to what I was trying to find. So this is not just Ignition. Like my Ignition only database only has a couple million hands because those hands are so hard to get. Just because you can't mass table and you can't data scrape them in any way that I don't think I don't know of any way it can be done, and I don't think any sites sell them. A good portion of this database was just hands that me and guys that do this kind of work together in a small group, threw a couple $100 together and bought some hands off of one of the aggregator sites just to beef up our sample size, and it was worth it for us to do that because we already had a good start. But no, we have stuff from all over. We have stuff from Stars, we have stuff from Party, we have stuff from WPN, we have Ignition. It's hard to get that many hands. I don't think too many databases out there have more than this, so you've got to kind of grab from all over. It's not just U.S. uh, to Yeah, I not easily the way I have it set up. I can't just click a button and pop up a different filter. But I mean, I could build such a report if I wanted. I know there's settings in Hand to Note here, that's what this program is that the database is built inside of. There's settings where you can, in the same way that I captured things to only be 3 to 6 handed tables, or I think rather more specifically, hands where anywhere between 3 to 6 players were dealt into it. I guess if you've got 6 guys at a 10-handed table, it's still a 6 max for my purposes. And also filtered for 200 no limit or above. You can also filter by site and room and stuff like that. There's all sorts of options. I wasn't trying to filter for the different sites. There was some theorizing with the guys that I do this work with that certain American sites in theory might play like Ignition. So if we wanted to look at an Ignition specific database with a larger sample, we could combine stuff like Stars New Jersey and Stars Nevada, or I think there's a party poker in the U.S. Don't do it. Are they different? Okay. 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 There's there's a spot, yeah, and people are building the game around a spot. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I personally like I have some Ignition only stuff up here on the left, and I do almost all my work here in the main database, 200 limit plus. I want the biggest sample possible, and I haven't dug into it a ton, but I've dabbled a little bit, and while the results are inconclusive, I'm not finding massive differences between the different pools or databases. But my Ignition only is literally Ignition only. I didn't merge anything else in there. I'm like, well, I'm going to stick to just Ignition in the meantime, unless I have some real good reason not to. And it sounds like what you're telling me is the opposite of that, Slurgo. I've got every good reason to not put anything else but Ignition in that database. Um, mhm. Mhm. Okay. Good to know. I mean, I've never been on any of those sites, but okay. Yeah, it's people got wind that a fish is in the game, so they're jumping in trying to clip him before the next guy does. Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, yeah, River's a big spot. Pre-flop stuff, I think people still are making mistakes. People are missing three bets. They're calling three bets incorrectly, not four betting enough. I mean, there's some deviations there. Yeah, I mean, never heard too much back from him on that. I mean, I think he's still working on some real large solves where he has some kind of node locks in there. I ran some smaller stuff myself. I wasn't using a cloud computer, I was just using a home machine, and so I was using simple preflop to run, some not real big, but like three, four, or five handed type preflop solves. And I was doing stuff like give different raise first in sides to see which one they prefer, to see if any one is clearly the best, and it seemed pretty inconclusive. Like it was picking all different sizes, and it was kind of mixing all sort of hands between them. It wasn't real obvious. Like it was always putting aces in a big size for value. And for the most part, what I found is that what's that? Yeah, even though the pool's not three betting enough in most spots, the solver wasn't liking to expand its range that much because even though it was not three betting enough, they're calling you in position so much, which well, it's probably not correct. It also makes your opens less profitable because they're in there, making you both pay rake and chewing up some share of the pot. What? Mhm, mhm. Mhm. Okay. Yeah, there's probably some merit to that. Hard for me to prove, but I definitely see the argument. The other thing I found pre-flop was that it seemed like as you got later on, like the button that was starting to add a few more hands, it didn't really go as crazy as I thought it would. But I was using some pre-flop stats for like the regs are playing the small blind against the button pretty well. That they're three betting pretty damn aggressively in the stats that I've got. So there's not much reason to do that there. The biggest example I found was that blind on blind is where they kind of missed some of the defenses, and it was even more pronounced against the smaller size. So if memory serves correct, what the solve was doing, like when I just sort of did a blind on blind with it, and I gave the small blind various raise first in options, and then node locked the big blind, big blind's frequencies to match what the pool's frequencies were against those various sizes, and tried to construct the ranges reasonably intelligently in a way that seemed reasonable and made sense to me. What it was doing is that solver was opening the small blind a decent bit more blind on blind, and it was also pushing things pretty heavily towards the smaller size. Like the min raise, it has to be defended so much that even if they're folding in just about anything, they're still probably folding too much in that spot. So what the solver liked when I gave it the node lock that was the most interesting to me as far as pre-flop stuff went was blind on blind. It started using the min raise a lot more often and started ramping up its open frequency quite a bit too, just because they're missing some calls and they're certainly missing three bets. So I don't get too much into that stuff. I like to sort of keep my ranges or frequencies rather pretty close to what a solver would recommend, and maybe a few spots every once in a while I'll isolate a bit wider than I otherwise would because I really want to take a crack at this fish before somebody else busts them, or there's a guy that's an obvious nit in the big blind, so I'll rob him a bit more. But by and large, I'm just trying to keep myself set up that's balanced in a way I'm comfortable and familiar and used to playing, and just keep myself exploiting them in small ways without making any mistakes on the earlier streets, and get myself set up on the river where they're going to have screwed up their range, where they've got a range they just can't defend properly, and my range is still constructed pretty solidly where I can just exploit the pool tendencies, and I'm not really all that exploitable myself. That's the approach I take. But for people that want to start exploiting earlier streets, there's certainly some merit to it. I've dabbled in it some. I seem to be more comfortable. I have more fun and seem to do better when I keep things, you know, as closer to GTO or a version of GTO as possible in earlier streets, and I gradually start deviating and taking advantage of mistakes I see them making as we get later on down the line. That to me is the theory, but that's a philosophical approach that people could very reasonably disagree with there at the same time and say, screw this, there's an exploit to be had right now, I'm going to go get it right now. And I can't argue with that either. the uh, the Yeah, well, that's true. The preflop exploits I like best is that I'll raise first in just something like a solver would do, sort of mimic its frequencies, and my ranges aren't the exact same as solvers, but they're pretty close to what a solver would do. But what I'll really do is it comes down to responding to RFIs or responding to three bets. I'm in the small blind. The cutoff raises first in. I go to three bet my standard, probably something like an 11% three bet range, something in that ballpark. Wait a sec, this guy's been a massive nit for the last 6 orbits, and his pre-flop stats are showing me that he is clearly tighter than the average bear in that spot. I'll deviate there by treating him as if he's a reg opening from middle position as opposed to the cutoff, and then therefore my three bet range gets tighter. So I'll exploit pre-flop by taking an eye what somebody else is doing and then respond accordingly. Like same thing with the big blind. I would normally defend this hand here, but even though he opened the button, he's only raised 10% of hands over the past half an hour. I'm going to treat that like a tighter spot. I'm going to fold some of these more marginal hands and not play them all. Or three bets as well, because the pool misses some three bets. Okay, I'm not gonna defend some of these marginal solver approved three bet defenses with a call, because they're not three betting enough to make that call warranted or profitable. It's been a while at this point, but I ran a ton of node locks in Pio Solver Edge, the preflop version, where I node locked various preflop three betting ranges and then saw what the defense ranges would be against various sizes and frequencies. And so, okay, I'm on the cutoff. The small blind three bets me. I should defend, whatever percent I'm supposed to defend here for a call. But it's a fish. The fish are passive. The fish don't find nearly enough three bets in that spot. I won't use a GTO three bet defense. I'll use a tighter, they're supposed to be three betting 11%. They're only finding 7. I'll use a tighter node lock for 7% out of position three bet range instead there, and I exploit them by folding, which sounds weird to say that, but a player that doesn't three bet you enough, that what you do is you exploit their tightness by not giving them action with your marginal hands that you would give action to against a proper player, against a solver. Yeah. Mhm. Uh-huh. Yeah, because they're mixed frequencies because they're break even one way or the other. It doesn't make or break you. That's a good point. Mhm. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Mhm. Mhm. Uh-huh. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. They won't have that crazy smattering effect that you see. You don't see it in solvers very often, but you see it in the big blind where it's little pieces of a bunch of hand kind of thing. And I've never tried to get into memorizing that or randomizing that kind of stuff. I mean, I have even for big blind, I have simplified ranges that mimic the correct frequencies for both calling and three betting, but I don't really mix a whole lot there either. I know the best players will say that's wrong, but I'm not trying to be the best player. I'm trying to play a strategy that I can replicate and I can use to beat up on these mid stakes games, or I guess 200 limits really a small stakes game, but there's still money to be made in those games at the same time, and then and to me getting a strategy I can replicate and play and I can remember and I can execute is more important than, well, I'm supposed to have, Jack six suited 30% of the time here in that range. It's just like that to me is, it's not that it doesn't matter, but if I was a world class player, that's where it would start to matter. I'm trying to beat 200 no limit and 500 no limit. I can do that without worrying about that kind of bullshit. There's other stuff that's more important. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's a good implementation. I thought that was pretty clever. It RNGs, but for any one time, you're okay. Well, this particular spot, what RNG it for me for this one situation where the cutoff's first in, and it tells you which hands you're pure raising, pure called in, and pure folding with no further mess. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I'm not missing my frequencies. I'm just not getting too much into how I'm mixing. It's just yeah, yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. If it's remotely reasonably constructed range, the shape of the range, if you will, and the frequencies are matching where you're supposed to be, even though it's technically incorrect from a theoretical standpoint, that anything that's not perfectly GTO is somewhat technically incorrect, you're not costing yourself anything meaningful or anything significant by doing that. No way, no how. Yeah, and that's the last thing any of us want to do, believe me. I assure you of that. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, you're just trying to hold serve against the regs. Don't make any major mistakes, and if and put yourself in a spot where you can catch their punts if they screw up, but don't start punting to them. You're not really trying to take advantage of them until you see a mistake that you can identify and that you can take advantage of. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's yeah, it's Pareto principle in practice there, 80-20 rule. You're going to make 80% of your profit from the worst 20% of the players in the pool, or maybe even more extreme in examples like this. Might even be like 90% comes from the 10% worst players or something like that. Nobody's doing this because they're trying to beat the best regs in their stake unless they've got some serious ego issues that need to be checked at the door. You're doing this to beat up on the people that don't have a clue what they're doing. Yeah, yeah, yo, yeah. Oh, mhm, mhm, yeah, mhm, yeah, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, no, it was good time, guys. Money. Thanks for putting together. Slorgo, thanks for jumping in. Yeah, this Yeah, and this is also fairly complex stuff, and lots of effort and thought and man hours have gone into this kind of thing. Like if any of this sounds like is confusing or you don't fully understand it, do not feel bad, because I mean I was a pro player in my 20s for 4 or 5 years before I took some time off, and I came back and sort of relearned the game and spent years again getting back to this. I mean, it would take you, I mean, I've spent thousands and thousands of hours of playing and studying poker. So if some of this stuff is going, wow, that's not all making sense, don't feel like it's not for you. You're not supposed to understand all this stuff right off the bat. No. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the research and analysis that helps you figure it out, it can be tricky and complicated, but the implications and the implementation ends up being pretty simple. That's an interesting paradox. Mhm. Yeah. the- Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. It's not four individual streets chained together. It's an integrated four-street game. You can't just isolate each individual street in a vacuum and have it work out. And that's the one of the old, or perhaps even probably a current misconception a lot of players have, is that fish will not fold the river enough. You shouldn't bluff fish on the river. And people think that because they call down with some kind of silly, stupid stuff that they shouldn't call you down with, but they also still overfold, and it's more subtle in that, you see them when you bluff the river and they call you down with fourth pair, and you're going, how the hell did they look me up with fourth pair? What's this guy thinking? You don't see as blatantly and don't remember all the times they fold because they called you barreling, they called you down with too many draws, and you get to the river and they've got no choice but to fold because they should have never got there with their eight high gut shot, but they did, and now they've got no choice to fold it out. So, and it's subtle, but in this report, the fish are overfolding the river, at least in a vacuum, pretty heavily too. Yeah, yeah. So, thank you. Yeah, yeah. Just pin. Oh, well, thank you. If you pin me down, I'm willing. I'm just not always able and available. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, hurry up. I might leave here if I don't do this in the next 10 minutes. So let's start now. Otherwise I could be gone again for a week. Okay. Yeah, I think that's about everything. Anything else we missed? Any questions from anybody that's listening? Oh, there. Oh, yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to sign off. I'll see you around. Yeah, take care, Slorgo. Take care, Money. Welcome.